Our planet faces an unprecedented health, social, and economic crisis, one that puts every nation on Earth in danger and challenges all fundamental assumptions about our world. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse decades of development progress, putting the Sustainable Development Goals at risk. It has brutally exposed the vulnerability of developing countries and magnified the inequality that exists both within and between nations. This is the first opportunity since the pandemic began for world leaders to come together and create global solutions for trade and development. The almost 200 countries represented here have a unique opportunity to do things differently, to do things better, to make sure global trade benefits everybody equally. This is our opportunity to forge a shared destiny between developing countries and developed ones, to use technology to create better productive systems, to cut carbon emissions and give our planet another chance, to put in place effective financing for development and establish a sustainable global debt system. We have the potential to give everybody the opportunity to succeed by bridging the digital divide, improving gender equality, boosting productive capacities, and investing in our youth. UNCTAD15 is a moment for us all to act together, to employ bold new thinking to help address the biggest challenges that face the world. Together, let's create a more equitable and prosperous future for everyone. Together, let's move from inequality and vulnerability to a future of prosperity for all. Because now, more than ever before, trade needs to work for everybody.
Greetings from Barbados. I'm Sharon Marshall. It has been a long and winding road which has brought us to this point. There have been many diversions because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But today we meet finally to open the 15th quadrennial session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD15. We are bringing the opening ceremony to you from the Lloyd Erskine Sandiford Center here in Barbados, and from the Palais des Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. We are also joined virtually by delegates from UNCTAD's 195 member countries around the world. COVID has not only forced us to move from an in-person conference to a virtual one, but the protocols implemented as a result of the pandemic have also limited the number of persons who could be invited here to witness this moment. There's also a small audience at the Palais des Nations, and at this point, I want to welcome my colleague, Peter Okwache, who is in Geneva. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon to you too, and thank you very much, Sharon. Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great honor to be part of this opening ceremony of the 15th quadrennial conference of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. My name is Peter Okwache. I'm from Nigeria, but I'm also a senior broadcast journalist with the BBC based in London. Now, the heavy lifting continues here in Geneva with negotiations for the finalization of the outcome document. And I'm especially glad to say that Barbados is also very well represented here in Geneva by a high-level delegation. It's led by a representative of Prime Minister Mia Amor Mottley. Ms. Sandra Husbands is a minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in Barbados. Thanks for joining us. Today we are also joined on the podium by the Deputy Secretary-General of UNCTAD, Ms. Isabel Durand, and also the Secretary of the Conference, Mr. Miguel Bautista, and last but in no way the least, the President of the Trade and Development Board, Her Excellency Ambassador Maimuna Kibenga Tarishi of Tanzania. Jambo, Your Excellency. Jambo. We have also been joined by a number of delegates and friends of Barbados and UNCTAD. A big welcome to all our participants, not only here in Geneva, but those of you who are joining us online. Now, this is no doubt a very important conference, as it presents a great opportunity to build the political will to effect systemic changes needed for a better recovery, which must not only be green, but resilient as well, and just as well as digital for everyone, not just for those people who can afford it. Thank you very much, and back to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Peter. We're now witnessing the arrival of the platform party. Leading the way are Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development of Kenya, the Honourable Betty C. Maina, and Secretary-General of UNCTAD, Ms. Rebeca Grynspan. They're making their way to the platform. And now, Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honourable Mia Amor Mottley, and United Nations Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres. They make their way to the platform. We welcome Prime Minister Mottley and her distinguished guests, Secretary-General Guterres, Ms. Maina, and finally, Secretary-General Grynspan. Welcome. We announce the arrival of the Governor-General of Barbados, Her Excellency Dame Sandra Mason. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please stand for the arrival of the Governor-General. Okay, well then I have to give you an opportunity to sit again because I'm informed that the Governor-General is not quite here. So thank you once again. Things are planned and don't always go to plan, but I'm going to ask you, Peter, what's the atmosphere like in Geneva?
Well, earlier on, Sharon, you said we had a small audience, but I'm happy to report that it's quite a sizable audience that we have here at the Palais des Nations, and everyone seems eager to hear what our panelists have to tell us today. I think we've got great stuff in store for us today, and once again, a very big thank you to all of you who've made your time during what is a particularly difficult period to be with us here at the Palais des Nations. Sharon.
Yes, Peter, it has been quite a season. We are sometimes quite amazed at how COVID has changed our lives and has affected virtually every aspect of how we live our lives. And this conference has been in the planning for several months. Initially, we should have completed it in October last year. Then we moved with some hope to the arrival of vaccines that could bring the situation under control, and we had set a new date for April of this year. But it became quite evident that that would not be possible since the trajectory of the virus has been quite mystifying, quite daunting for those of the persons who have responsibility for managing the pandemic. Governor-General of Barbados is making her entrance. The party is being escorted into the room now, and we are going to ask you to remain standing as Dame Sandra makes her way to her seat, and we ask you to kindly remain standing for the playing of the national anthem of Barbados. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. The national anthem of Barbados, played beautifully by the band of the Royal Barbados Police Force. This is probably the last major occasion on which they can be referred to as such, since Barbados is moving resolutely to republic status by November 30th of this year. Kenya assumed the chairmanship of UNCTAD at UNCTAD15, which was held in Nairobi. President Uhuru Kenyatta is en route to Barbados and won't be here for the opening ceremony. However, he's ably represented by Cabinet Secretary in the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Entrepreneurship Development, the Honourable Betty C. Mena. Ladies and gentlemen, I now turn the proceedings over to Ms. Mena.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. The Honourable Prime Minister of Barbados, Amor Mottley, the UN Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres, UNCTAD Secretary-General, Ms. Rebeca Grynspan, Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, in accordance with Rule 16 of the Rules of the Conference, and in my capacity as a representative of the Presidency of the 14th session of UNCTAD, I have the honor to declare the 15th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development officially open. I'm supposed to do that, right? I wish to congratulate Barbados for hosting the UNCTAD15, and we are honored to have you, Madam Governor General. I have every confidence that under Barbados' leadership, the conference will be highly successful and lead us towards new, creative, and innovative solutions on trade and development and interrelated issues. I would also like, on behalf of the President of the Republic of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, to warmly welcome the UN Secretary-General Mr. Guterres to this 15th session of UNCTAD. Indeed, your presence here today is a clear indication of the importance that the United Nations attaches to advancing the trade and developing agenda, particularly as it relates to the meaningful integration of developing countries into the global economy. As mentioned, His Excellency the President, President Uhuru Kenyatta, could not be here today, but he wanted to share a message with us by video. And I now invite our technical team to play the video.
Your Excellency, Mia Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, Your Excellency Rebeca, Grynspan, Secretary-General of UNCTAD, Honourable Ministers, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let me say how pleased I am to join you, though virtually, for the opening of the 15th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, our UNCTAD15. It is unfortunate that the prevailing COVID-19 pandemic and other challenges have made it difficult for all of us to meet in person today. But however, I am confident that given the resilience and resourcefulness that we have developed during the pandemic, that we will have a productive and indeed transformative conference. I want to in particular thank you, Prime Minister Mottley, and the UNCTAD Secretary-General for making the smart decision not to postpone the conference once again after the postponement of last year. Thanks to the advancement in technology, it is possible for all of us to hold this conference today. Your Excellencies, I cannot forget to note that Barbados is the smallest nation in the world to host such a global event. And in doing so, Barbados has acted true to form, punching well above their weight, as it has consistently done, and served as a model to all nations of the world that indeed size does not matter. Thank you, Prime Minister Mottley. Thank you, Mia, my sister, for setting the pace for global leadership from our South. Let me also take this opportunity to welcome Ms. Rebeca Grynspan, the new Secretary-General of UNCTAD. And Ms. Grynspan, you take the helm of this great institution at a time when our world is at crossroads. Ladies and gentlemen, international and national actions taken today will have a lasting impact on the strength and sustainability of our post-COVID-19 recovery. The role of UNCTAD, which is, and I quote, to support developing countries access the benefits of a globalized economy more fairly and to deal with the potential drawbacks of greater economic integration, is today at a greater premium than it ever has been. As you may be aware, protectionism is on the rise, and glaring inequalities in the distribution of COVID-19 resources has revealed flaws in our multilateral frameworks. Building momentum towards recovery and resilience will require improved global coordination of policy choices. Kenya commits to support you, Ms. Grynspan, as you spearhead UNCTAD through what is likely to be a complex but defining UNCTAD15 agenda. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as has happened every 4 years since 1964, the UNCTAD Quadrennial Conference have provided a platform for member states to work together to redress inequalities in trade, finance, technology, and investment. Kenya was indeed privileged to host the UNCTAD15 here in Nairobi in 2016, which resulted in the adoption of the Nairobi Mafikiano Consensus and the Azimio outcome documents. The Nairobi commitments were organized around 4 pillars, and these were namely multilateralism for trade and development, sustainable and inclusive economic growth, productive capabilities and capacities for structural and transformation, and lastly, the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Evidence available now shows that there has been significant progress in the implementation of UNCTAD14's commitment on several fronts. And I will endeavor to focus on the first 2 to demonstrate this point. On multilateralism for trade and development, important regional partnerships have in the last 4 years been established. These partnerships, I believe, will strengthen the bargaining power of similar economies, and amongst these include the 1 historic agreement establishing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which entered into force in May of 2019 and started trading officially in January of 2021. The agreement represents a unique collaborative effort by African countries to bolster regional integration and to bolster intra-Africa trade. The second is the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations, PACER+, which was signed in 2017 and entered into force in 2020. It was a free trade agreement between the Pacific Islands Forum and Australia and New Zealand, which provides a framework for the future development of trade cooperation. The strengthening of the Organization of Africa and Caribbean and Pacific States, which cuts across continents and brings together 79 countries from diverse parts of the world to work together on global challenges and to promote sustainable development. As the current president in office of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, I have witnessed the power of solidarity to push for a common agenda. The fourth is the Africa CARICOM Summit, which held its inaugural meeting less than a month ago. The summit aims to unite the people of African descent to manage shared risks that require multinational response, and to catalyze fast recovery and growth through the expansion of trade and investments. With respect to the pillar promoting inclusive sustainable growth and development, UNCTAD has worked closely with member states to share knowledge and to support capacity building. UNCTAD's flagship reports have provided critical analysis to guide evidence-based policies on trade and investment. I want to congratulate our host, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who is currently the chair of the IMF Development Committee. During her tenure, she has advocated for a historic multilateral response that called the World Bank Group and the IMF to work with other global partners to contain the impacts of the pandemic and urge richer countries to agree on a multilateral mechanism for orderly debt arrangements. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as I have demonstrated, UNCTAD has played an important role in supporting the implementation of the UNCTAD15 commitments, and the role will become even more critical in the next 4 years. The theme for UNCTAD15, from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all, is indeed most welcome. It seeks to leave no one behind by addressing inequality and vulnerability and by ensuring that trade works for all. Implementation of this agenda will take place in the context of major global challenges that have become even more pronounced since UNCTAD 14. The COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented socio-economic disruption, which has exacerbated the vulnerabilities of many countries, as well as widened inequality. It has reversed or stalled the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, rendering millions of people to lose their lives as well as their livelihoods, and many have fallen back into extreme poverty. As tax revenues have dipped due to the contraction of economic activities and the increase in the debt burden, the fiscal space to provide a safety net to vulnerable groups in many of our countries has equally been significantly constrained. The multilateral trading system has also come under mounting pressure due to trade tensions and rising economic nationalism. The inequality in the sharing of vaccines reflects a multilateral system that is deeply flawed. To date, recovery has been unbalanced, reflecting faulty lines that existed before our pandemic. There have been substantial differences in GDP growth between regions and countries, and a sharp divergence in income gains among social groups. So, distinguished delegates, this conference, the UNCTAD15, provides all of us a platform to put development back on track by focusing firstly on transforming economies through diversification. Secondly, fostering more sustainable and resilient economies. Thirdly, improving the way development is financed. And fourthly, revitalizing multilateralism to achieve a sustainable, inclusive, and digital world of shared prosperity. We already have a framework for transitioning from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. It includes goals and targets established through the Addis Ababa Financing for Development Conference, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Paris Agreement on climate change. It is now time to move from promises and commitments. It is now time to accelerate implementation of these promises and pledges. As I conclude my remarks, I wish to reiterate my call for the international community to come together to work towards a functional multilateral system to enhance pandemic preparedness and response to build a robust global healthcare architecture. No single government or multilateral agency can address these threats alone. We must work together in solidarity if we are indeed to succeed. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is now with great pride and joy that I announce that tomorrow, the 5th of October, 2021, I will be passing the baton to Prime Minister Mottley as the host of UNCTAD15. I take this opportunity to congratulate Barbados for this honor, and to you, my sister Mia, my confidence, and I believe the confidence of all members of UNCTAD in your ability to drive our agenda forward. I thank you, and may God bless you all.
I would like to profoundly thank the President of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, for his kind remarks, which sets the stage for our discussions towards a successful outcome of this conference. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Item 2 of the provisional agenda of the conference relates to the election of the President. The nomination of the President of the Conference for UNCTAD15 was circulated to all member states, and no objections were received. Therefore, in accordance with Rule 17 of the Rules of Procedure, I now have the honor to declare the Honourable Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, elected as the President of the 15th session of the conference by acclamation. It is so decided. I congratulate the Honourable Prime Minister Mottley and hand over the proceedings to her as the President of the conference. Karibu.
Dame Sandra Mason, Governor-General of Barbados, President Irfan Ali, President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, the Honourable Betty Mena, Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development of Kenya, Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. António Guterres, our new Secretary-General of UNCTAD, Mrs. Rebecca Grynspan, Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, and certainly not last but family, the Honourable Carla Barnett, the newly elected Secretary-General of the Caribbean Community, and may I say a special welcome on your first official visit to our country. Ministers of the Government of Barbados, Leader of the Opposition, Members of Parliament, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished guests all, I really want to thank all of you in UNCTAD for electing me as President of the 15th session of the Conference on Trade and Development. I want to thank also the Secretary-General of the United Nations for coming today, and generally for his strong and wise leadership of the global community at this very, very difficult and challenging time. Your words remain as the beacon for all of us, particularly those of us whose size cannot counter the voices of others. I'd also like to thank you because your presence here today truly signals to us and the international community that you are with us more than ever now at this time when we face our greatest challenges. We do not take your presence here lightly. I'd also like to thank the new Secretary-General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Grynspan, for joining us. This is literally the beginning of your tenure, and we feel honored that we can be part of that journey with you, particularly since, as President Kenyatta said, you undertake this responsibility at a time when there is a growing movement towards protectionism, even if in the aid and pursuit of the protection of national populations from the pandemic. It is not an acceptable excuse for that rise of protectionism, but it is one behind which, regrettably, too many countries are hiding. And I'd like to thank also President Kenyatta, who will join us later tonight, and as he indicated, will formally hand over tomorrow. But I want to thank his Minister, Cabinet Secretary, for her presence here and for acquitting herself this morning in a way that have allowed us to move on with this proceedings. My dear friends, this is an interesting moment for the world in which we live. And many asked why Barbados would even want to assume this responsibility. This organization was formed to give voice and protection to developing nations. If ever there was a time for that voice to be heard on issues of trade and development, it is now. There are many small island developing countries and LDCs that have had to endure the most difficult of periods. 1 or 2 generations after these countries have become independent, we have found ourselves now grappling with factors that undermine our very ability to sustain our economies and to sustain our societies. And at the very time when the world needs, literally, support and a constant assurance of fairness and equity, it is receiving the opposite. We do not envy your role, Secretary General, but we also know that you are our last best hope to get it right. And I say so conscious that the political will that is now necessary for you to be successful has to be lined up and marshaled. We hope that this conference, along with the other activities that are due to happen later this year, COP26 at Glasgow, as well as the WTO ministerial, that it will give us an opportunity to be able to ensure that those issues that regrettably have been on the table for too long can literally be moved ahead and that we can see positive movement. We recognize that that is not going to be easy, and we recognize that there will still be battles because those who benefit from the status quo have no interest in altering the circumstances of our people. We have come to this point hopeful that the Bridgetown Covenant, which we are hoping to be the outcome document of this conference, as well as the Spirit of Speightstown, so named because it is intended to capture the spirit of that fledgling group of people who, even from the early days of the settlement of this nation, knew that they had to stand for something, even if the consequences of their standing for it would lead to their death. I refer, of course, to the early stories of King Cuffy and the rebellion of 1675, which this country is only now coming to learn about. But we believe that the battles that they faced, which also seemed incapable of being conquered to many, that we equally today face similar battles. And we therefore hope that this political declaration that shall come at the end of this conference shall be the one that will allow us to start the marshalling of the political will of the nations of this world to an outcome that will benefit the people of this world and the planet on which we live. We therefore hope that the Spirit of Speightstown, anchored by the Bridgetown Covenant, will therefore create that framework over which the next 3 years we can work to advance the causes of this great organization. Hence, today is not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a journey for us as we move forward. We also believe that we have a duty, Secretary Grynspan, for us to advance not just the other words that we've heard throughout the years, but also the reality of small island developing states and LDCs. Against that backdrop, we find resonance with our colleagues within the Caribbean community, who, along with us, have continued to raise our voices for too many issues for too long. One, the issue of addressing our inherent vulnerabilities, in particular, our exposure to the climate crisis. Secretary-General Guterres, we know of the excellent work that you are trying to do, you are doing, and that you are calling for with respect, particularly for us, with respect to adaptation. I pause here because if the world cannot find the political will to have the increased ambitions to allow us to pause at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, then it is sending the very clear signal that they are prepared to play Russian roulette with the future and fate of small island developing states, who occupy 1/5 of the global community of nations. It is an unfortunate signal, but it is one that, if you are a student of history, you might not be surprised, for the world has seen failed states, failed civilizations, and indeed extinction of species. We would want to believe that we will summon the will, but we are equally pragmatic and recognize that if the will cannot be summoned to contain the increase in temperature that is necessary to sustain our societies and economies in the best way that we know is in our interests, then we must see a commitment to increase the funds that are available for adaptation, and indeed the manner in which those funds are delivered to us. It is immoral and unjust in the extreme for persons to cause our suffering and our societies and economies to be confronted with an existential crisis and then say that we should pay to correct it on our own. That is as immoral and unjust as it comes. We therefore hope that your efforts and calls, along with our political action, will lead to our being able to see at least 50% of the funds being committed for the purposes of adaptation. And I trust and pray that our visit with you yesterday would have allowed you to see why we are now in need of that kind of assistance, because the intense climatic activities resulting in either flash flooding or in droughts and water shortages have led to significant problems for countries such as ourselves, and we have not even started to talk about coastal erosion and the extent to which the destruction of our coral reefs have had such a negative impact on our marine life and marine resources. I pause at this point because the talk about vulnerability is not new. And it goes back to 1989 in the Commonwealth. And it is amazing that for us now to see movement on this topic, we have had to see damage and loss rather than vulnerability. And damage and loss are the children of vulnerability. And that we, as human beings, have not been prepared to protect each other in spite of the United Nations Charter is a moment of great regret for us as small island developing states. But it isn't only vulnerability with respect to climate. We are dealing with the issue of trade. And from the beginning of my entry into public life, I have heard persons speak over and over and over about special and differential treatment. And yet, it remains outside of the reach of our nation states, which clearly have shown that even with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, the kind of fair and level platform that we expected has not really materialized, and that the consequences of it for small states such as ours has been the decimation of our productive sectors, particularly in the areas of agriculture and manufacturing. It is ironic that the COVID pandemic that has so clothed the world now has laid bare the absolute need for food security on the part of island states. The disruption in transport and logistics has made it absolutely clear to all who can see that without the development and structuring of a robust capacity to feed our own people, we will not be able to sustain our development. And it is ironic that it has come in the context of this pandemic to be confirmed, and we hope and pray that both in the World Trade Organization as well as in this entity, which is designed to build consensus within the UN system on matters of trade, that it is ironic that we will now have to confront these issues. We tell people we want food security, but then we ensure that countries do not have the tools that they need to protect local production, and those people who are in the business, for example, of farming, cannot be part-time farmers and cannot wait for a crisis, a hurricane, a pandemic to then develop the capacity to start farming again. My friends, I trust and pray that this conference will bring to the fore the issue of food security, particularly for island states and landlocked countries who do not have the capacity to control transport and logistics easily. It raises the issue of the kind of support globally as well, particularly for regions such as ours, divided by the sea, but connected in a common community and remaining outside of the opportunities for full development, largely because of the absence of appropriate sea and air transport linkages to link our people. The second major issue is that of debt challenges. And we all know that in many instances, many of the developing countries of the world, not just small island developing states, but middle-income countries with limited access to the capital markets, have literally been suffering before, and those within the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn have already become the victims of the climate crisis. The debt mounts as we support our people who are on the front line of this crisis. And very often, the post-Washington neoliberal consensus would want you to believe that high debt is only the consequence of poor governance. But high debt is also the consequence of an international system that wants a one-size-fits-all prescription, as I just mentioned in the WTO, and also wants to relegate those of us who are the victims of climate to have to pay for our damage without necessarily accounting for it with respect to the debt to GDP. I am enthused, Secretary-General, by your commitment in the common agenda and by your commitment generally to start the process of recognizing that the singular use of GDP cannot be the basis upon which concessional finance or access to other types of measures can be used. The utilization of cruel proxies for access to goods or financing, or even in the case of the pandemic, where maternal mortality was used to determine whether countries should be able to access therapeutics and vaccines, in this region of the Americas is a most unfortunate development and reflects more a lazy mind on the part of those who are doing the work rather than a determination to act appropriately to the needs of the people whom they're intending to serve. I hope that we can work with you, and it was against that backdrop that Barbados, in my speech at the United Nations General Assembly, has committed to moving a resolution in plenary, because it is important that the world stand up and be counted, and that there be a reckoning of those who are prepared to stand in the interest of the pursuit of development, and those who are prepared to leave that to serendipity as if the future of our planet and our people do not matter. The problem with high debt is that it will get higher in a climate crisis. The problem with high debt is that it leaves us little or no fiscal space in order to meet the challenges, not just of development as we would want to do, exemplified by the SDGs, but it allows us, regrettably, or it forces us to have to fight up to decide where we spend money in defense of the victims of a Hurricane Elsa in Barbados, or in pursuit of the deepening of our healthcare system such that it can deal with the underlying causes before the pandemic of the other pandemic of one, chronic non-communicable diseases that regrettably has engulfed and taken over so much of the developing world. And secondly, the slow motion pandemic which is to come, which is that of antimicrobial resistance, which is already taking the lives of almost 1 million people a year and is expected to take more lives than any other source of death by 2050. If we do not have the fiscal space, we cannot put measures in place for any of these things. And we find ourselves then being victims once again of circumstances rather than being in a position to chart the development of our people. The debt crisis can become a financial crisis, and that is when it becomes particularly dangerous. And that is when we then see the echoes of 1929. We pray that we do not go down this road, because to be forewarned is to be forearmed. The third topic relates to the question of diversifying and strengthening our productive capacities to build economic resilience and to take advantage of the growing digital economy. There is no doubt that the digital economy is fully and completely within our grasp. Look at what we are doing. I see Isabelle Durand, who, Rebecca, is your deputy. Isabelle, it is wonderful to see you, and we thank you for being that person to help bridge the gap in the last few months for a successful conference. But we can only see her because of the utilization of technology in ways that can add serious value. We have, however, to bridge the digital divide. And this is one of the 6 areas, Secretary-General, that you have pointed out, must be tackled if we are going to deal with the fundamental issues of inequality and vulnerability in this world. And I trust that we therefore will appreciate that we need to start at the very beginning. The COVID pandemic has led to more children being left outside of the school system over the course of the last 20 months. And next to the death of persons, it is for me the greatest tragedy of this pandemic. That we have had to go online is great potentially, but that we have gone online with so many offline is a tragedy. And to that extent, therefore, we must ensure that connectivity, access to electricity, access to tablets that are affordable and rugged, and access to content are immediately within the hands of our young people in this world. If not, we will find that the worst problem that we will confront is bright people without opportunity. People with ability without opportunity. That is the recipe for social instability. At the same time, those of us who live in tourism and travel dependent economies know that there is no time to be wasted in the deep and further diversification of our economies. Last year, 2020, saw every country in this world who depend on tourism and travel see double-digit declines, and in most instances, ours was at the lower end at 17%, but most people, and most countries, would have gone 19, 20, 25, with the outer extreme of a 35% decline in one state. The only countries that equal that level of decline in the world economy are those countries that are war-torn. If that does not lay bare our reality, especially since in almost every instance there are small island developing states on the front line of the climate crisis, then I do not know what will do so. And finally, there's the issue of health and trade that more and more will occupy our concerns, not just in the WTO, but it must occupy our concerns nationally and within the context of UNCTAD. The reality is that before the pandemic, we had serious issues that we were facing in our health systems. Before the pandemic, many of the small states of the world who were previously colonies were already fighting to be able to provide a new deal for their citizens with respect to access to health care from primary to tertiary. And even in developed countries, the cost of healthcare financing has literally brought countries to their knees. We have to find a solution that works for us all. And I'm not satisfied that the continued exploitation of small states by large pharma companies can work in our best interests. And to that extent, even as it relates to vaccines, we have maintained that there needs to be an international clearinghouse that provides fairly for access to countries, not just in terms of access as well, but in terms of costs. Because in so many instances, countries are literally being left on the margins because of their lack of capacity to access the costs of medicines and pharmaceuticals. There is so much more to be done to support healthy lifestyles, and we believe that those small things can also change the trajectory of countries if we can get populations to understand that the primary responsibility for health care is yourself, even if governments must facilitate and nurture the environment within which you can be protected and receive the best health care possibly. I look forward to the deliberations of this conference over the next 4 days. And the government of Barbados believes that we have a responsibility, irrespective of our size, to play in the conduct of global affairs and in the settlement of those difficult problems that have left those people of the world who have been marginalized outside. In this conference center in 1994, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development for Small Island Developing States was held. And out of that conference, which came 2 years after the Rio Earth Summit, and in fact this building was built to accommodate that conference, out of that conference came the Barbados Program of Action. That then led the way to a number of other United Nations declarations. We have seen some progress, but we have not seen sufficient progress. And we hope that at this meeting of UNCTAD, and at this point where we become the smallest state in the world ever to host a conference such as this, that our voice can find resonance globally, among our colleagues within the small island developing states, among our colleagues within LDCs, among middle-income countries, among the developed world, to recognize that if we do not give purpose to this organization, if we do not find a just and fair way for the pursuit of international development, if we cannot ensure that our citizens receive the basics of life, food and shelter without being threatened by the climate crisis, that these actions will come to naught. We do not wish our name to be associated with failure. And to that extent, our government, our Caribbean community will work assiduously to ensure that these issues are kept to the fore through advocacy, but more importantly, that the policy initiatives and the legislative framework that we need at the national level can be put in place, because we will have developed a platform for consensus. Those who, however, want to stand against that march to progress for development, we simply say that time and good ideas ultimately will win out. The question is, how many people will suffer and fall before we reach that point? Secretary General, I have confidence in your leadership. The government of people of Barbados have confidence in your leadership, and we pledge ourselves to work with you on the common agenda, because we believe without that common agenda, the public spaces of the world will be diminished. I thank you, and I invite now at this stage, Secretary General, you to give your opening remarks to this conference. Thank you very much.
Madam Governor General, Excellency, Prime Minister Mottley. Sorry?
Thank you very much.
Madam Governor General, Excellency, Prime Minister Mottley, Secretary-General Grynspan, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. I want to thank Prime Minister Mottley and all Barbadians for so warmly welcoming us. And in particular, I will never forget the wonderful day that Prime Minister Mottley has given me yesterday, showing me the enormous effort her government is making in order to make sure that Barbados is able to defeat COVID, to defeat climate change, and to defeat inequality in the world. And I also want to thank everyone who is part of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. A gathering like this comes only once every 4 years. UNCTAD15 is the Olympics of trade, development, investment, policy and technology discussions. And we need your advice and guidance today more than ever. 2 weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, I had the opportunity to sound the alarm. A wake-up call to the leaders of the world, and a call to action to tackle the cascade of crises facing us. poverty and inequalities, conflicts and climate change, environmental degradation and disasters, mistrust and division. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has claimed almost 5 million lives so far. The pandemic has wreaked havoc across the global economy. It disrupted the powerful economic engines of trade, manufacturing and transportation. And millions of jobs have been lost at a time when social protections remain out of reach. 120 million people fell into poverty last year, and 811 million are going hungry. Tens of millions of children remain out of school, particularly girls. And for the first time in 2 decades, the Human Development Index has declined. Excellencies, we are moving in the wrong direction. Decades of hard-won development progress are slipping away before our eyes, and the Sustainable Development Goals are at risk of failure. We need to turn this around with a bold, sustainable and inclusive global recovery, one that benefits the many rather than the few, one that delivers hope to people and healing to our planet, and one that levels the playing field for all countries as they support their people during this extraordinary moment in history. There is seemingly good news. Some estimates show that we are in the midst of a substantial economic recovery, with world GDP growth ranging between 5% and nearly 6%. But we know the other side of that story. This recovery is not evenly shared. Advanced economies are investing nearly 28% of their GDPs into economic recovery. For middle-income countries, that falls to 6.5%, and it plummets to 1.8% for the least developed countries, 1.8% of a very small gross domestic product. In all, more than 8 out of every $10 in recovery investment is being spent in developed countries, not in the countries in greatest need. Dear friends, an uneven recovery is leaving much of humanity behind. And until we get serious about vaccine equity, recovery will be stuck at the starting gate. Wealthy countries have far more vaccines than people, yet more than 90% of Africans have yet to receive their first dose, and this is an outrage. And as variants take hold and spread, this is a recipe for disaster threatening us all. As I have said repeatedly, the world must mobilize behind a global vaccination plan with clear targets for every country. We need to dramatically ramp up vaccine production and get them into the arms of 70% of people in all countries in the first half of 2022. But vaccines are the first step in a much longer race. Your team this year, from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all, captures the heart of the challenge. I see 4 glaring challenges which, if not addressed, make any notion of prosperity for all a distant dream. First, debt distress. Systems starved for investment, unfair trade, and the climate emergency that leaves small island developing states like Barbados perilously vulnerable. The first challenge is the imperative to tackle debt distress. Left unchecked, debt distress is a dagger through the heart of global recovery. Countries cannot build back if they are held back. The international community has taken a few positive steps, but it is time for a quantum leap in support. That is why today at UNCTAD15, I'm proposing an urgent 4-point debt crisis action plan. To start, we know national budgets are being stretched thin by COVID-19, so we must push for an immediate expansion of liquidity for the countries in greatest need. I welcome the recent issuance of $650 billion in special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund. But this support largely goes to the countries that need them least, as they are distributed according to the quotas. And today I'm calling for a substantial reallocation of unused SDRs, not a symbolic one, a substantial reallocation to vulnerable countries that need them, including middle-income countries. Second, we know countries are being crushed by debt service costs, so we need an extension and expansion of the G20 debt service suspension initiative into next year. The initiative and the common framework for debt treatment beyond the DSSI have potential to ease the debt crisis, but they are too limited in eligibility and time frame. Suspending debt service should be extended into next year and also made available to all countries that need it, including middle-income countries. But third, we know suspending debt payments will not be enough to many countries. They will need effective debt relief involving both public and private creditors. I renew my call for a comprehensive strategy around reforming the international debt architecture, including debt restructuring or reduction, especially for middle-income countries, to help them avoid deadly cycles of debt waves. We should look at innovative debt instruments like debt swaps, buybacks, and exchanges. Fourth and finally, we need private finance to help fill the gap. It is deeply unfair that rich countries can borrow cheaply and spend their way to recovery, while low and middle-income countries struggle to keep their economies afloat. We need to bring together the public and private sectors to develop innovative financing tools to accelerate the return of private investment to pre-pandemic levels, which will in turn accelerate recovery. And we need to increase multilateral development bank assistance to lower risk and draw capital to bankable, job-creating projects in communities that need them. Taken together, this debt crisis action plan can help ensure that no government is forced to choose between servicing its debts and serving its people. Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants, le deuxième défi immense auquel nous sommes confrontés, c'est la nécessité d'assurer un relèvement durable et équitable pour toutes et tous. Partout dans le monde, le Covid-19 a privé tous les programmes de soutien au développement humain des investissements nécessaires. Si nous ne passons pas à la vitesse supérieure, nous n'atteindrons pas les objectifs de développement durable. Nous devons aider les pays à réaliser des investissements courageux dans l'éducation, la protection sociale universelle, les soins de santé et le travail décent. Nous devons faire premier l'humain sur le profit, notamment en répartissant équitablement la charge de l'impôt et mettre fin à l'évasion fiscale, au blanchissement de l'argent et aux flux financiers illicites. Les membres du G20, le système des Nations Unies et les institutions financières internationales doivent collaborer avec l'OCDE pour donner suite aux progrès récemment accomplis en vue de création d'un cadre mondial pour l'imposition des sociétés. Il est temps de passer aux actes et de faire en sorte que les impôts profitent à celles et ceux qui vivent là où se déroule réellement l'activité économique. Au plus près des gens, pas dans les lointains conseils d'administration. Third challenge is to reignite the engines of trade and investment and ensure they benefit the poorest countries. COVID-19 has put the brakes on contribution of trade to economic growth. The trade to GDP ratio remains below pre-pandemic levels. And the pandemic also derailed investment, with foreign direct investment plunging by 35% last year. And in its current state, the global trade system remains heavily stacked against the poorest countries. They are victims of unfair trade rules and barriers, unpredictable commodity prices, outdated infrastructure and transportation systems, and lack of access to digital tools. We need open and fair trade rules so all countries can compete on a level playing field, no matter their position on the development ladder. And we also need to help developing countries modernize their infrastructure and trade flows, reducing costs and increasing efficiencies. This is vital to support their transition to green economies grounded in sustainable and renewable energy. It includes modernizing transportation, especially the shipping industry, which transports 80% of global merchandise. automation and digital solutions can reduce bottlenecks and help this vital industry decarbonize. Which brings me to the fourth major challenge facing us, the need to build a global green economy. Small island developing states like Barbados are looking to the future with worry, and increasingly to the global community with a cynical eye, and for good reason. They hear the words, but they do not see the actions behind them. We often act as if we have another planet waiting for us. We don't. A green and resilient recovery means committing to net zero emissions by mid-century. More ambitious 2030 climate and biodiversity plans. COP26 in Glasgow must keep the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement alive. No new coal plants. Phasing out subsidies for fossil fuels and polluting industries. Putting a price on carbon and channeling that back to schools, hospitals, social protection and job creation. And supporting developing countries as they make the shift to green economies by implementing the promise to provide at least $100 billion every year from the developed countries. For countries like Barbados, on the front lines of the climate crisis, adapting and building resilience is not a luxury, is an urgent priority. Right now, adaptation remains the neglected half of the climate equation, accounting for only 25% of climate finance in support of developing countries. Small island developing states only receive a fraction of the funding that goes to developing countries for adaptation, less than 2% in 2019. Small island developing countries, the most impacted by climate change, receive less than 2% in 2019 of the support to developing countries. So today I repeat my call to donors and multilateral development banks to allocate at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience. We need leadership. Countries cannot wait for others to make the first move. Developed and developing countries alike have a responsibility to act. The fossil fuel economy is itself becoming a fossil, one that has left its imprint on our Earth for too long. It's time to shift our support to building a sustainable green economy. Excellencies, as Prime Minister Mottley reminded the world in her stirring address at the General Assembly last week, and I quote, "We have the means to give every adult a vaccine, and we have the means to invest in protecting the most vulnerable on our planet from a changing climate, but we choose not to." End of quote. My friends, it's time to make better choices. Through your discussions at this conference, we can explore new ways to learn from yesterday's mistakes and avoid repeating them. We can make progress to ending the inequalities that hinder sustainable growth and prosperity for all. And we can recover better together at this extraordinary moment in history. And I thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General, for, as usual, very strong and clear remarks, and ones that give us considerable hope. But as we both know, it comes down now to the political will of those nations across the world to make these things a reality. Before I introduce the Secretary General of UNCTAD, I also want to acknowledge the presence of the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Rachel Lumama from from Kenya, and also my dear friend Monica Juma, who is also the Cabinet Secretary, I believe, for Energy, who is also with us today. Secretary General Grynspan is the first woman to lead this institution, UNCTAD, and we take great pride at your appointment. We believe that your friendship, for the Global South allows you to be eminently qualified for this job. And on behalf of the government of Barbados, I would like to take this opportunity to wish you success, but also to pledge our unwavering support and assistance for you in the effort of making this organization that beacon organization yet again for developing countries to ensure fair trade and the pursuit of development for our people. I invite you now to the podium to address us. Thank you.
Her Excellency Dame Sandra Mason, Governor-General of Barbados, Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, thank you so much for those words. I take them to heart, really thank you. President of Guyana, Honourable Minister Betty Maina of Kenya, please Minister, let me send through you my thanks to President Kenyatta for his encouraging and supportive speech towards UNCTAD and myself. Thank you so much. So glad to see you again here today. Dear Secretary-General of the UN, dear António Guterres, thank you so much for giving me the honor to be here today. Dear SGs of the Commonwealth and of CARICOM, dear friends, so good to see you here with us today. Ministers and representatives from member countries, Your Excellencies, dear friends in the podium in Geneva, ladies and gentlemen. The states participating in the conference are determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, to seek a better and more effective system of international economic cooperation whereby the division of the world into areas of poverty and plenty may be managed and prosperity achieved by all, and to find ways by which the human and material resources of the world may be harnessed for the abolition of poverty everywhere. End of quote. This, Your Excellencies, is the first paragraph of the foundation document of this conference, signed 57 years ago. A statement whose principles and ideas have stood the test of time and whose goals are now more urgent than ever. We stand, as was said, at a critical point in the history of multilateralism and in the history of this conference. Secretary-General Guterres has highlighted the many challenges that threaten the world. His presence here today is a testimony of the importance of this conference and of the role UNCTAD is called to play in this critical moment. Thank you again, Secretary-General. I must also thank our host, Barbados, and its Prime Minister, Ms. Mia Mottley, for the leadership and the organizing both the first semi-virtual conference in UNCTAD's history, the first conference we hold in a Caribbean country and a small island developing state, a fact which should remind us all the urgency of tackling climate change, not only mitigation, as was said, but adaptation to climate change, which for many island states is a matter not of change, but of survival. I am honored to start my journey together with you, Prime Minister Mottley. And let me commit myself to the seats. That, I promise you, very soon, you will see concrete steps so that we can express in concrete results we are doing here today. Dear friends, this pandemic that has been so painful for us all is still far from over, and many developing regions are seriously facing the prospect of another lost decade and the reversal of their hard-won progress in the combat against poverty, inequality, food insecurity, and gender discrimination. Following a very asymmetric crisis, we are now witnessing a deeply divergent recovery. with advanced countries growing and vaccinating at rates many times greater than those in the developing world. This trajectory, as was said, if continued, will leave many people behind. This will not be prosperity for all. There are many reasons behind this divergence, as mentioned by Secretary-General Guterres. But no doubt the inequalities we are witnessing in the access to vaccines and financial resources are today at the very heart of this divergence. Lives and livelihoods that could be saved are not being saved in wide regions of the world. And that is indeed an outrage. While advanced countries are already discussing third doses, LDCs, as was said before, have only vaccinated a mere 2% of their population. Making matters worse, COVAX just announced that it will be forced to decrease its vaccination target by 20% this year. And it is already well known that many of the donations it is receiving carry the burden of being too close to their expiration dates for them to be efficiently distributed and administered. On top of that, trading systems have been disrupted and subjected to ever-increasing unilateral policies, as was pointed out by Prime Minister Mottley and President Kenyatta, and we are facing spiking transport and maritime prices that are hurting the developing world and its capacity to recover. Access to financial resources tell a similar story. Advanced countries have just produced the largest and most heterodox expansion ever seen in fiscal and monetary policies. Developing countries, on the other hand, dealing with large and differentiated debt burdens, as well as very limited fiscal margins, dear Prime Minister, have spent only a fraction of what is needed to respond adequately to the multiple demands of this health, socioeconomic, and climate crisis. And I fear that without immediate international action, they will have to get back to austerity measures, hurting even more their prospects to recover. The recent emission of special drawing rights, the debt service suspension initiative, as well as the support from key countries to intellectual property rights waivers have no doubt been good news, as was stated by the Secretary-General. But let's remember that 650,000 billions in special drawing rights is a tiny fraction of the almost $10 trillion G7 countries have spent on their own recovery. And on top of that, as was said by the Secretary-General, they receive 40% of the special drawing rights that they don't need. While, for example, LDCs with 100 million more people living on them receive only 2.3% of the total. Will this again be too little, too late? I remember that when we were in the debt crisis of Latin America, at the beginning of the 80s, we said that if we didn't receive immediate help and international help, we will have a lost decade. And dear friends, we had a lost decade because swift action was not taken. Our host, Ms. Mia Mottley, gave a thundering speech last week at the UN General Assembly, in which she used the idea of climbing sea levels to highlight precisely the fact that this is a human-made crisis and that none of what is happening is outside our human agency to fix it or to make it worse. Because all these factors are ultimately the result of deliberate decisions or of the lack of them, which is in itself a choice. Prime Minister, I was deeply moved and inspired by your speech. So let me borrow your words and ask you for an intellectual property waiver and use them to follow on the challenges we face. How much more must sea levels climb before we measure progress and development beyond simple GDP per capita? Before we finally understand that unequal and unsustainable development is not development at all, that the pre-pandemic all normal was only a mirage of progress, the enjoyment of the present at the expense of the future. How much more must sea levels climb before we see that a recovery with more inequalities and more poverty, with technology for the few and not the many, is not a recovery at all? Before we see that this path only leads us to societies that are more unsatisfied and mistrustful, and probably more fragile and violent as well. How much more must sea levels climb before we reivindicate the basic human right to a well-functioning state, to a state that provides health, education, social protection and security for all, before we see that many of our issues stem not from states that are too large, but from states that deliver too little, before we understand that the solution is not smaller states and larger markets, but better markets and better states. How much more must sea levels climb before we understand that development is a complex thing, and that there is no one-size-fits-all recipe for it, that we need to be humble and listen, that we need to honor our commitments, that our international cooperation systems need to change, and that change requires not only ODA, but trade, taxation, debt, and financial policies that are fair, bottom-up, and coherent. And that's why our Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, are so important, because they are the only universal agreed agendas that call for the necessary solidarity. Not only build back better, but to build back differently and build back together, because now we are building back apart. So let's us all be reminded, Excellencies, of the importance of what we can achieve this week. Because despite the obstacles and challenges, change is possible, and there is much that we can do together in this conference, like all the speakers before me clearly stated. First, to ensure that trade and logistics, so important for a recovery of the crisis, becomes more resilient and sustainable, less vulnerable to unilateral restrictions, to tariffs and non-tariff measures, so we can make trade fairer in a world that is already unfair. To close the digital divide that during lockdowns discriminated those who could work from those who couldn't, those who learn from those who miss school, and do it aware of the complexities of the widening data divide. To revert the massive retreat of investment flows that have far too long invested in already mature and already existing and already rich companies and markets, and direct them to where they are really needed, in developing countries, in small and medium-sized enterprises, in the innovative ideas of the young that we saw yesterday, and in funding sustainable development and climate resilience. To prepare for the next commodity cycle, linking commodities in new supply chains for a greener future, and to harness it to reduce commodity dependence, enabling diversified and productive economic structures. To bring to the negotiating table, to the rooms where the decisions are made, the voice of the developing world, and particularly of those countries who are landlocked, who are least developed, who are island states, countering their demands with new international support measures, but overall guaranteeing the representation of the diversity among us? Or do we think that we will get to better solutions if representation and diversity is not guaranteed? And finally, to support the Secretary-General's common agenda and the 4 points that so clearly he stated as a debt plan: the reallocation of special drawing rights, expansion of debt service suspension, debt restructuring and relief, and harnessing private capital. So countries, including the so-called middle-income countries, so badly called, as was so well put by the Secretary-General Guterres, are not obliged to choose whether to service their debt or to service their people, unquote. If this UN Conference on Trade and Development succeeds, it would not be the first time. Throughout our history, UNCTAD has risen to the challenge numerous times. The generalized system of preferences, the International Sugar Agreement, the integrated program of commodities, the proposal to create the SDRs, and the proposal to link SDRs and development finance, the creation of the category of LDCs, the proposal of a 0.7% of GDP dedicated to ODA, are only some of the tools UNCTAD has given the multilateral system, a system which would have been much weaker without them. Throughout our work, we have contributed to a world that is more aware of its own inequalities. But we need now to use this knowledge to find common ground and agree on blunt and urgent solutions to these issues. I have received your mandate to lead UNCTAD at this critical time, and as its first female Secretary-General, being truly aware of the immense challenges ahead. The next time we meet, UNCTAD will celebrate its 60th anniversary. And I hope to have delivered on the agreements of UNCTAD15, and in making this institution an ever more constructive partner to the UN development system and our member states. Our countries, our societies demand from us concrete measures for a more prosperous and less fragile world. To achieve that, we need to work on a more inclusive multilateral system and a revitalized UNCTAD that remains a strong and authoritative voice for developing countries and a sound and trusted partner for all who seek solutions to our most challenging threats. This is a mission that summons us all, a mission that will test the quality of our leaders and their capacity to avoid the temptations of the easy answers and the short-termism that may characterize our times. Leaders that are aware of this historical call, that will understand that the short and the long term start at the same time, and that we have no time to lose. Let me wish you all the greatest success in the days ahead. Thank you for the spirit that has prevailed in the negotiations toward the outcome document and for Barbados' political declaration. Thank you, dear Prime Minister. And let me just finish with a sincere thank you to all of you, to all of those that are with us in Geneva and that are following us. As I said, wish you all the greatest success and ask you to wish me the same in turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary-General Grynspan, and once again, thank you for reminding us of all of the things that UNCTAD has given to the global community and the multilateral system. Just as you have thanked those in Geneva, I'd like also to thank those who are in Barbados and ably led by Ambassador Teresa Marshall for the last 2 years and Carlos Wharton and the team that have allowed us to be here successfully today. Thank you very much to the entire Barbados team. Under Agenda Item 3, the establishment of sessional bodies, we shall now establish a main committee, the Committee of the Whole, to consider and report on the substantive item referred to it by the plenary. Pursuant to Rule 65 of the Rules of Procedure of this conference, the Committee of the Whole shall elect a chair. I understand that Ambassador Maimuna Kibenga Tarishi of Tanzania, President of the Trade and Development Board and Chair of the Preparatory Committee of UNCTAD15, has been nominated as Chair of the Committee of the Whole. May I propose that we elect by acclamation Ambassador Tarishi as Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Your applause has determined that it is so decided. I congratulate Ambassador Tarishi on her election. Let us move now to item 4, the election of the Vice Presidents and the Rapporteur. In accordance with Rule 22 of the Rules of Procedure of this conference, the Bureau of the Conference shall consist of the 35 members, comprising the President, the Vice Presidents of the Conference, the Chair of the Committee of the Whole, and the Rapporteur of the Conference. A list of candidates for the post of Vice Presidents was circulated last week with a silence procedure should there be any objections. We received, I'm told, nominations from the following 22 countries: Argentina, Bangladesh, Cameroon, China, Finland, Gambia, Iran, Iraq, Ireland, Kenya, Mongolia, Pakistan, Panama, the Philippines, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Spain, Switzerland, Thailand, Trinidad and Tobago, the United Kingdom, Venezuela. There were no objections to the silence procedure which ended today at noon Geneva time. Therefore, I declare the 22 nominees elected as Vice Presidents of the Conference. It is so decided. Through the same silence procedure, Ms. Yana Bruguère of France was nominated as Rapporteur of the Conference. As there was no objection, I declare Ms. Bruguère as the Rapporteur of this conference. It is so decided. We have now completed, my friends, the election of the Bureau of the Conference. I should like to warmly congratulate them all. I shall be fully relying on their cooperation and support, both individually and as members of the Bureau. In accordance with the past practice, the regional coordinators and the chair of the Committee of the Whole should be fully associated with the work of the Bureau. Let us go now to Agenda Item 5A, Appointment of the Credentials Committee. In accordance with Rule 14 of the Rules of Procedure, a Credentials Committee shall be appointed, and it shall consist of 9 members selected by the Conference. The committee shall elect its own officers. It shall examine the credentials of representatives and report to this Conference. In keeping with past practice, the Conference may wish to decide that the Credentials Committee shall be composed of the same 9 states appointed to the Credentials Committee by the General Assembly at its most recent session, the 76th session. Therefore, if there are no objections, the following countries shall be Bahamas, Bhutan, Chile, China, Namibia, the Russian Federation, Sierra Leone, Sweden, and the United States of America are therefore appointed as members of the Credentials Committee to the Conference. As there is no objection, let that too be so decided. Mr. Speaker, I'm beginning to sound like you. I congratulate the members of the Credentials Committee. Let us, my friends, now move to Agenda Item 6, the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda Secretary-General is contained in the document TD520 with annotations prepared by your Secretariat in accordance with the usual practice. The entire provisional agenda for the 15th session of the conference, including its substantive agenda item, was approved by the Trade and Development Board at its 67th session on the 2nd of October 2020. It is recommended that the conference proceed with the adoption of the provisional agenda as contained in document TD 520. As there are no objections, it is so adopted. As it relates to the organization of our work, the program of the conference has been made available on the UNCTAD15 website and includes 3 World Leaders Dialogues and 5 ministerial roundtables, and of course the general debate. That debate starts at 3:30 Barbados time, 3:30 Barbados time, 9:30 Geneva time. So in terms of the daily debates, so that those of you who are here, I'm making a point to the audience here, you will understand that this is now literally burning the midnight oil in order for us to complete this process. All that is left, therefore, for me is to conclude the proceedings of this open plenary, and as I said, to thank all who have worked so diligently over the course of the last 2 years. Our path to this point was not a simple point. We had, of course, to defer and delay, but ultimately, in recognition that this pandemic is now a marathon and not a sprint, we determined that the business of the world, and the developing world in particular, must continue, and hence our ability to be here virtually and physically, the hybrid model that I suspect may well come to be a new norm in the conduct of multilateral relations. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, not just in Barbados, but in Geneva, and to allow us then to bring this plenary to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. That concludes our opening ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and remain in place for the departure of Her Excellency, Governor-General Dame Sandra Mason. Dame Sandra is greeting Baroness Scotland and Dr. Barnett before she departs. It's an opportunity for her to greet them both. And she greets President Ali of Guyana. Now she's making her way out of the auditorium. Thank you, members of the platform party. Thank you very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So there you have it. UNCTAD15 is officially open with those remarks from Kenya, Barbados, Secretary-General Guterres, and Secretary-General Grynspan. Over to you, Peter.
Many thank you, Sharon. What great messages we have received from the leaders who are present today. Indeed, those opening remarks have underlined the urgency to align our development agenda with recovery plans to cure the current situation while we ensure an equitable, a fair, and just world. The calls made through the statements obviously highlight the huge task ahead of our membership to gather the necessary political will and also to craft a strong mandate for UNCTAD, which will serve to meet the needs of the 21st century and deliver a more inclusive recovery. I'm sure we all agree that that is what is needed at this point. Now, as we bring this ceremony to a close, I implore you to please stay with us, because in about 10 minutes we shall begin our first dialogue. As we have all witnessed in the last 20 months or so, the coronavirus crisis has made it evident how interconnected and yet vulnerable we all are. The dialogue will address the two current frailties we all face, namely health and climate change, and the global action needed to tackle them. So please join us in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much.